Tonight, I have the honor of introducing three really interesting and accomplished panelists that span a lot of different aspects of the nuclear weapons academic and policy world. First, we have Professor Sarah Roby, who's an assistant professor of history at Idaho State University. Her current research project is titled "The Atomic Citizens, How Citizens Are Affected by the Threat of Nuclear War and How the Nature of American Citizenship Has Changed." She teaches courses on the history of science technology, specifically on the history of energy and nuclear science. Next, we have Kelsey Hartigan, who is the Deputy Director of PONY, Project on Nuclear Issues, and a Senior Fellow with the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Before that, she was dual-hatted as a faculty associate at the Naval Postgraduate School and a senior advisor to the Director of U.S. Special Operations Command for Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate. And then from 2016 to 19, served as policy advisor in North Korea, WMD, Crisis Response Planning and Nuclear Proliferation in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy. Next, we have Dr. Avneet Sood, who is at Los Alamos National Laboratory in their nuclear weapons program, where he has been since 2000. He has had leadership roles responsible for approximately 50 technical staff, postdocs, and graduate students involved with Monte Carlo radiation transport methods and code development and a variety of radiation transport applications. His interests have been in applying the fundamentals of nuclear engineering to support the U.S. nuclear emergency response, counterterrorism, and non-proliferation efforts at the Department of Energy and NNSA, National Nuclear Security Administration. With that, I'd like to go forward and discuss essentially what is a important and perhaps unfortunately ever growing in salience issue, that of nuclear weapons. So to begin tonight, I'd like to ask each of you if I offer the premise that we're seeing a resurgence in the salience of nuclear weapons in international security, to what extent do you agree with this? And how do you interpret that resurgence? What are its causes and what are its primary contours that the audience should be aware of? Any of you, feel free.
Well, I can jump in to get us started. I think one thing that's really crucial about sort of analyzing how public anxieties grow and wax and wane, along the contours of nuclear fear. I think one thing that's really critical to what's happening right now is the resurgence of sort of a scary superpower, right? And although the Cold War is not in the living memory of a lot of younger generations now, I think there is some residual kind of understanding that nuclear weapons were the teeth of the Cold War conflict, right? And so with sort of Russia rising in global aggression, right? And not just with Ukraine, but certainly with Crimea previously, I think it's very easy for the public to make these connections. All of a sudden as a threat, and is that threat nuclear? Now, prior to the kind of resurgence of Russian aggression and that side of thinking about the global dynamics of nuclear weapons, I think that it never went away that there could be multiple superpowers and that those superpowers would be nuclear, right? For a long time, we were thinking about we were concerned about China, right? And its nuclear capabilities and its rise to power too. So I think there's this kind of framework that's a really easy fit, at least out in public. And here I'm not talking about nuclear, policy strategies so much, but there's a very easy and familiar kind of placeholder of superpower dynamics alongside nuclear dynamics.
And Kelsey, Avneet?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Well, thank you again for the invitation to be here. Really looking forward to the discussion tonight, and am really honored to serve on this panel. So, I think in response to your question, on the one hand, I would say yes, we're absolutely seeing a resurgence of the role of nuclear weapons, but I think it's probably more accurate to say, nuclear threats never went away, but I think current events are reminding us of those dangers that still exist. I have to say, for me, one of the things that I am most concerned about is the potential for a conventional conflict to escalate and spiral out of control. And so I think between Russia's invasion of Ukraine, between tensions with China over Taiwan, those are the types of kind of conventional conflicts that you worry about potentially escalating. And I think for the broader national security community, after 20 plus years of focusing on CT issues, the kind of broader national security community has really had to kind of take a deeper look at some of the fundamental questions around deterrence and escalation management that we just haven't really kind of considered for quite a while. So I think that leads you to that feeling of again, that resurgence, even though, like I said, I think, obviously those nuclear threats and dynamics had never gone away.
And to kind of piggyback on that, I mean, it's one of those things, each of us probably, this is in our minds day in and day out. So the notion that there is a resurgence is somewhat silly, but I'm trying to kind of think from the outside perspective, it seems to now be a blip on people's radar where perhaps it wasn't in the past decades. Avneet, what do you think about that?
So I have an interesting perspective because I live this, pretty much every day. So for the past 20 some plus years, I've been here at Los Alamos involved in the weapons program. And so I kind of live this. And so the way I tend to judge this, this resurgence or in the topic is I use my family really. So if my family asks, they see something in the news or they read something, they'll call me up, or my friends that know I tend to work in this area. So I use that as a temperature gauge in a lot of ways to see if it's coming up. So I think there's from a international relations perspective, right? This is when nations become great powers, they tend to compete. And one of the ways to defend themselves in terms of deterrence is nuclear weapons. So I think it has always been chronically there. I think there has been an interesting period with the end of the Cold War in '92 that I think is kind of unprecedented, but that the attention has swung just the opposite way, where people are now paying much more attention, more importantly, the press. It's getting constant hits. I used to count how many times I would hear the word nuclear in the press for many administrations, but I quit counting long ago because it became a common word. And it's only increased with the past 8-9 months.
Great, thank you. So something I heard across the three of you, and again, my head lives day in, day out in the deterrence world. And I tend to think of things in terms of great power politics and deterrence. I'm wondering, with that in mind, do you guys still each think of the nuclear threat landscape today in those terms, that it's still a great power concern? It's still a game of deterrence. And as Kelsey was saying, sort of like if we have these conventional flashpoints that perhaps at some point they will pop off and something will happen. Typically it's thought a misperception or fear or technological breakdown will lead us to crossing the nuclear threshold. So for each of you, I'm curious to know, how do you see the nuclear threat landscape today? And again,
so I can jump in. I think as you alluded to, I think it is a very complex security environment right now, and nuclear landscape in particular. We have, Russia has been undergoing a significant modernization of its nuclear forces. China is on pace to also significantly increase its nuclear modernization in a way that it has just simply has not done before. We continue to have nuclear North Korea. We have negotiations that may or may not pan out with Iran and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So we have just a number of different issues. And I think, to your point, how we think about deterrence, I think one of the big challenges for the nuclear policy community going forward, and that they're really wrestling with, is how have the fundamentals of deterrence that the nuclear policy community knew well, lived and breathed every day during the Cold War, how do those dynamics change when you also have potentially a significantly bigger Chinese nuclear program as well? And so trying to figure out again how that changes some of the deterrence principles and again the escalation dynamics in particular, while also still having the nuclear threat from North Korea as well. It is an incredibly complex landscape, and that really does kind of make this space really challenging at the moment.
Sarah, Avneet?
So I really agree that today's complexity is very different than the Cold War complexity, right? I think everyone would agree to that. I think the landscape, however, is not quite as, let's call it linear, right? If you do A, then B happens, then C happens, then D happens. I don't think it's quite as linear as that. There's a lot of ambiguity, and that's been a strategic kind of a way to use nuclear weapons as a part of the strategy, is to remain ambiguous in many ways. And so I do think there's some previous thinking that helps guide and understand the past. But I think the current thinking today is revolutionary, because we have not had at least we from the U.S. perspective have had. It's usually just been a bilateral kind of threats, but now it's multilateral, and not just in the nuclear space. It's multifaceted, right? So cyberspace, a bunch of other things, conventional things take place. So it's not just as simple as it used to be, I would say. The other thing, go ahead.
And it wasn't simple.
It wasn't simple then. That's right. I think the one thing I do keep in mind, in the back of my mind, is that we've been talking mostly in nation state kind of terms, but there's always that terrorist element, right? That doesn't follow the traditional deterrence kind of theory, and that's the thing that doesn't fit. It's something that also should not be off of our radar. And so if you read the usual strategy documents that come out of any of these administrations, that is still part of what we talk about.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this type of question is definitely on the minds of some of our attendees based on the questions that have started to pop up in our Q&A. But I think one thing that's really important to think about is, I totally agree that the bilateral element is totally tossed up in the air now, right? We're dealing with a very, very different kind of assortment of players and assortment of potential types of weapons, right? However, if we kind of rewind and think back into the Cold War years, there were several moments across the span of the Cold War where deterrence kind of came into question, or at least deterrence in the simplest sense, the simplest kind of public way of thinking about nuclear deterrence. Okay, country A has a bunch of guns and country B has a bunch of guns, and they don't want to hurt themselves, so they prevent war from happening, right? But if you looked at kind of the early 60s and then again in the 70s, there were these moments where high-level nuclear strategists were thinking about tactical response, tactical weapons, and how that kind of filtered into what we thought about deterrence. Kind of trying to move away from the massive retaliation kind of logic that dominated throughout the 1950s. And I think this was in large response to just the growth of global arsenals, as well as the growth of the destructive possibility of the sorts of nuclear weapons that we're talking about. So between 1945 and the early 60s, it's a totally different technological landscape too. And so I think I just want to flag here that deterrence theory has never been totally stable. And since the Cold War, I think, yeah, we've encountered new ways of thinking about what the threat landscape is. And while I certainly can't speak to closed door discussions now, it's just important to note that it wasn't just one thing until the Cold War ended. And now we're in a post-Cold War landscape. And so we're thinking about Plan B.
Fantastic. On that, if I could, use the purview of the moderator just to add in, there's this, I think what current events are revealing is nuclear deterrence in particular. What kind of drew me to it is it's very speculative. It's very much imaginary, right? Fred Kaplan has this book, Wizards of Armageddon, and he talks about, ideas being tossed around in the halls of the Pentagon, and then decades go by, and then the same ideas go bouncing around in the Pentagon again, but somehow they're different, they're new. And I think you could look at, things that the Trump administration said and couch it as new. And I swear, if I did a word search in, something from 1972, I could find exact phrases where we've just taken out adversaries and put them in. So there are this cyclical process of ideas that keep competing, and one dominates and then another does. And over time, there is much less consensus and much less surety about nuclear deterrence. And I think probably the public knows that it's all incredibly speculative, how it works, if it works, when it works. On that note, in terms of what the public may hear a lot about, but not really understand, something was mentioned, I think Kelsey brought up nuclear modernization. And we hear oftentimes about, Russia is engaging and Putin is engaging in nuclear modernization. China is engaging in nuclear modernization. And it's often in the political rhetoric, it's a heightened threat that XY country is engaging in nuclear modernization. So I guess I was wanting to know what is nuclear modernization, and it's a variety of things, but what do we mean when we say that? And then, probably something that Avneet could speak to in particular, what is it in this country, right? Because, we do that a lot. And I've spoken to some people in Avneet's profession that say, when countries build new nukes, if they had old nukes, then that's not the worst thing. Like, we want these things to go off when they're supposed to and not when they're not supposed to. So I guess I'd like to hear from you guys in terms of what is nuclear modernization, and then to what extent is it heightening threat versus perhaps mitigating threat in some cases?
So I'll start with this one. There's some, in fact, as I start to think about the question, one of the things I want to state here is I'm here just as a citizen, right? I don't represent my laboratory in any official way in this way. And all the things I would to say here would be from their programs of record, things that you can find on their websites. So in terms of modernization, I think one of the things to keep in mind, it's maybe a topic for later on, is we've moved away from nuclear testing back in '92 under a moratorium, and we put in place a science-based stockpile stewardship program where we're, instead of build and test kind of attitude that we had since 1945, where we would, these were physics experiments all the way through, right? We had about 1,000 nuclear tests, and these were essential physics tests in a lot of ways. So we moved away from testing to a science-based stockpile stewardship. So that's the first thing to mention. The second thing to mention is that these weapons that we have, they were designed in the 50s and 60s and created roughly in the 60s and 70s, somewhere in there. And they're old. These are very complex, pieces that we rely, we hang our hat, our deterrence, our national security on these weapons. So they're awfully complex. And so they're very old in the age. And so in terms of modernization, the NNSA has roughly 4 programs, or it has exactly 4 programs that they talk about. And how do we modernize a warhead? And they do this through a life extension program. Basically, that's the first type, where basically we're refurbishing a weapon. We're taking, these things age, materials decay. It's a very harsh environment that, these materials are subjected to just in a static state. So there's a life extension plan. So we refurbish things. So we essentially replace pieces that are worn out, and we want to extend the life another 20 to 30 years. So that's the first step in modernization from the US perspective. Second one is a modification, a mod, where we take an existing kind of type and we meet new operational requirements for the military. So the laboratories, the military will come to the laboratories and say, hey, we have a new operational need and we need to modify an existing platform. So that's the second type. We have a lot of modifications based upon existing things. So this third type is an alteration. And again, this is smaller than a mod, where we make a change just short of a operational change. If the requirement changes, but yet some piece needs to be replaced or needs to enhance safety or make some slight change, an alt happens, an alteration. And the last step is really the warhead acquisition. That's, hey, now the requirements really have changed significantly. And the existing stockpile cannot meet the requirement. So we have to provide something new, but it is based upon previously tested designs and components that do not require additional testing. So those are the four things what the US means, what the NSA talks about when they talk about modernization. They talk about a life extension plan, they talk about mods, modifications, alterations, and then acquisition, warhead acquisition.
Thank you. Sarah, Kelsey?
Yeah, so I think, I'll kind of take us a little bit of a different direction. And I think the kind of bigger, broader question here is for Russia and China in particular, what do their modernization plans tell us for the future? And so I think it raises a question of, we have used arms control agreements between the US and Russia, impose limits to strategic weapon systems. And I think there's a question, the current New START agreement, it will be in effect until February 2026, hopefully. And we saw last week that the Russians had said that they were not going to allow inspections. Inspections have been on hold for a while because of COVID. But so I think some of the broader modernization efforts that have been underway for a while, it raises a broader question. And again, that's in the future, if you don't have arms control agreements in place and there is a significant growth in the overall number and then the diversity of nuclear weapons, that's what the kind of broader question is here. So I think it's helpful to kind of put that in the context of some of those broader dynamics, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Sarah?
Yeah, I think my perspective here is less about what it would take to revise or revamp either our arsenal or the strategies behind how we think about implementing that, or revising deterrence strategies. I think one of the questions from Colonel Whalen that just came up is about how do we modernize our public safety approach in a heightened threat environment. And this is an aspect of my research that I spent a lot of time thinking about civil defense and sort of where nuclear preparedness went after it sort of fizzled in this country in the 1950s and 60s. And some of that answer is sort of bureaucratic. It's that in the 70s, civil defense, nuclear preparedness, nuclear public safety became folded into FEMA's mandate. Okay, so the same emergency management strategies that we use for natural disasters, industrial disasters, also now includes nuclear strikes or nuclear disasters. And FEMA has suffered, I think. FEMA has had its difficulties in the last several decades. But the logic behind preparing for disaster, generally speaking, became much more thrifty, much more, fiscal austerity kind of paved the way for an approach that tries to do everything at once in a really kind of thrift just keeps coming to mind here. And so compared to the 1950s when there was some budget line for educating the public and having them go through duck and cover drills or air raid drills, that has been completely eclipsed by much more pressing matters for FEMA now. And that's, climate related disasters. That's these huge billions and billions of dollar natural disasters that happen. And so, Colonel Whalen, I don't have a happy or optimistic answer for you given our current state of emergency management in the United States. But I think it's worth talking about if we're entering a new or adapted state of nuclear preparedness from a strategic or from a technological and science perspective. Should we also be thinking about turning a new page with nuclear preparedness at the public level? I don't know. I think that's a steep hill to climb, but it's a question worth asking.
I'll just add to that final comment before moving on to another topic. Everybody probably on this panel, many people in the audience have seen this article that came out this week about the possibility of nuclear winter again. And as I read that, again, someone who lives and is developing kind of decision experiments about different nuclear conflict scenarios, I saw that and thought, oh, if the world is told that nuclear war equates to nuclear winter and Holocaust, then why should we take any steps for civil defense, right? So I think part of the issue could be that the public is constantly told, for very good reasons, that the prospect of a limited nuclear war isn't real, and so that the use of nuclear weapons equates to nuclear winter. And if that is the mentality that we're trying to convey to the public, that runs counter to trying to actually spend money to mitigate by having post-conflict strategies, or telling people to duck and cover, which actually can help. So that's interesting. Thank you, Colonel Whelan. Both Avneet and Kelsey brought up new weapons, and that's a couple questions in the Q&A. And someone mentioning that they've heard Russia has new nukes, and a lot of the conversation about the potential for Russian nuclear use in Ukraine is at the tactical level, which again, after studying this for years, tactical is a really, really weird term. And euphemistic by many people's standards. So I guess I'd like to have you guys talk about what is new in the world of nuclear weapons design. Avneet mentioned in terms of mods, there are some mods that the US has done recently, taking an old bomb and giving it some slightly new capabilities. But then we hear about Putin and his nuclear cruise missile, and different things that China is doing. So I guess I'm kind of curious to go with our previous question about how we educate people. Has nuclear weapons design proceeded to a point where we can consider nuclear conflict in a different way? Then it may not be as big and ugly as it was thought to be in the Cold War.
So I'll kick us off in this area. So from my opinion, from my perspective, I think what is new is not really new design types. What we're looking at here, we're constrained by a test ban, right? These are I've talked about this being awfully complex. It's just like comparing cars, right? You can have a variety of flavor of complexity, things from a Ferrari class to something that is just a lawnmower engine or something, right? So in terms of complexity, they're awfully complex. So doing something new is awfully difficult, especially in the absence of testing. And so the idea here is to rely on things that we know have worked. And so I think some constraints those are the major constraints. So I've mentioned the US approach has been for the past almost 30 years, is getting close to 30 years, is a science-based approach to replace the experiment-based approach, and where we do small-scale testing to give us confidence to make predictions. And so the idea here is, when certifying these these weapons. The laboratory directors have to do an annual assessment and report to the president that the confidence in the nuclear stockpile. And the way we build that confidence basically is through small scale experiments and then high performance computing and with simulation basically. And so the idea of doing something brand new from there's a phase approach to this. The NNSA has starting from zero all the way to from a new concept design all the way to retirement. There's a process that the DOE NNSA has defined. Doing something brand new is a new design is awfully difficult. I would say very risky in a lot of ways. So what I would say is new is likely much more on the delivery vehicles, operating within delivery side, but also on the weapons physics in terms of what have we done before, right? I don't think things are new, but just looking at history, because we have a long history at this.
And do other countries, China, Russia, etc., engage in the same pretty conservative mentality that you've expressed?
I don't know. I really don't know what it's not a topic that I know very much about. But I think the idea here is it makes sense from the simple arguments I've made before. These are complex items. They're not easy. You just don't go develop one in your basement kind of thing.
Yeah, and I'll jump in on that last question. So the Department of State every year puts out a compliance report, and if folks are really interested and want to geek out on this, you can see some of the questions that have been raised about subcritical testing in particular, but that compliance report does kind of track some of those related questions. I wanted to go back to the question though on tactical nuclear weapons, and I think the concern, and we're seeing some commentary around this right now, again with Ukraine. There've been questions about whether Russia's strategy and doctrine if they have a we'll call an escalate to de-escalate strategy, and so the concern is, would Russia use a tactical nuclear weapon, which, as Zachary said, there's not an actual common universal definition to what constitutes a tactical nuclear weapon. But the concern really is if the Russians would do something like that in an attempt to what they would perceive as, again, kind of de-escalate the conflict and try and that the US would say we don't want things to spiral out of control. And that would then allow them to restore things to a favorable balance. We're also seeing similar concerns. There have been some public reporting about North Korean development of tactical nuclear weapons. So again, I think the broader concern for the question that was raised here is whether or not that lowers the threshold for use, and if it does, whether then that could potentially escalate and spiral out of control. So that's, again, particularly, like I mentioned kind of at the outset, in that conventional conflict scenario, those are the concerns where you worry about that escalation happening, and whether the notion that somebody could use a tactical nuclear weapon to, again, kind of to try and calm things down. That's a very simple overview of the concern of that we're seeing, again, kind of play out with the Russians.
And Sarah?
Yeah, as a historian, I don't know that I can speak too much to what's going on right now as far as new weapons designs. But certainly the thing that, when I teach nuclear history, we often, try to incorporate current events into what we're learning about historically speaking, but attaching them to what's going on today. And certainly one of the things that raised a lot of eyebrows, was the Trump era kind of abandonment of some of our more recent nuclear treaties. But also, thinking about, I'm fuzzy on the details here, but maybe 6 or 7 years ago, right, Russia announces that it's got this new kind of low-flying missile, and somebody else is going to have to pick up the slack on what that was. But these things, they come into the news cycle, right, and it's very easy for people to connect the dots with, okay, well, there's a new missile, or North Korea has gotten this far with this missile test, this distance with the missile test. It's very easy for people to imagine then what it would mean to equip those sorts of missiles with a nuclear payload, right? And so, yeah, that's about all I can add to this particular line of conversation, but I think it's, what both Kelsey and Evnit said resonates with my experience of watching people observe current events with this as well.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to flip to arms control, which I kind of see as perhaps the counterpoint to deterrence. So we were talking about the complexities of deterrence and different actors. I believe Evnit alluded to the fact that today in nukes, we're not just talking about nukes anymore, that typically when academics or policymakers are considering what used to be a conventional to nuclear dynamic, it's now a cross-domain or multi-domain dynamic where we have nuclear and cyber and chem bio all running simultaneous, and the exact escalation language, what constitutes a step relative to another use is still in flux. So there's a lot of ambiguity there and opportunity for what Kelsey is mentioning, the spiraling to a larger conflict that no one actually wanted. So in this context of multi-domain considerations and having all of these different actors of vastly different arsenal sizes and technological sophistications and economic capabilities, what is the future of arms control right now? We have the future of US-Russian arms control, which is this new start that was signed under the Obama administration. And then we have last year, the demise of what was seen as the linchpin of Cold War arms control, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. And that kind of takes us to this tactical question that we're seeing in Ukraine. And then we have the Iran question, right? That's something that's just happening on the back burner of the media. But this administration is still in negotiations with Iran and the other parties to try to do something from the Iran nuclear deal. So what do we see as the future here? I've heard usually that any future big arms control agreement needs to take China into account. China has recently said, we're not going to do much until you guys get on board and start building down. So if we're looking to arms control as a way of mitigating the nuclear threat, what can we hope for? Where will that happen?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the question du jour. I think the challenge, as we were talking about earlier, at this point, the question is so the New START agreement that you mentioned. There's a question of whether or not New START could actually be extended when it expires in 2026. Again, I would say prospects for that aren't looking too hot. As you alluded to, the Chinese have no interest in joining a future replacement to New START that would also include the Chinese. And I think we've seen, you mentioned INF, but we also have the CFE, the conventional on the conventional side, that the Russians, I think it was in 2007, had kind of walked away from that. And if you look at what the Russians have been doing in the context of the Biological Weapons Convention, where they are spreading all sorts of lies and accusations there to just grind the mechanisms behind the BWC to a halt. So I think if you look at the kind of several of those broader trends, the prospects for nuclear arms control in particular aren't looking so great. I think the question now is, that's true until it isn't. And so I think, whether or not there is a change at some point, there's some interesting questions that the Ukraine conflict potentially raises for the Russians, because their conventional forces are are being depleted in a way that again raises this kind of broader question of as the Russians need to reinvest in some of those conventional capabilities, do they end up relying more on nuclear weapons, or is there a potential opportunity at some point where maybe again, in order to have frankly more resources to put towards the conventional side, they're willing to agree to some caps on the strategic nuclear weapons side. But you know, again, I think that's the challenge, is because that the prospects for arms control are rather challenging at the moment. That's what's driving some of these broader questions about a potential arms race and what some of those kind of longer term questions would be if there are no longer any agreements in place.
Would either of you like to add to that?
So I'll jump in, if that's okay. So I think the way I tend to mentally think about this problem a little bit in terms of cross-domain kind of arms control agreements, I tend to think of a line in terms of a threshold for armed conflict, right? So if you bring cyber into it, you bring space into it, you bring a few other things into it. I think there's a wider margin when it comes to a threshold. There's a gray zone, right, in terms of tactics that are typically below a line of armed conflict. Nuclear, on the other side, is clearly on the opposite side of that. Conventional things, bio things, those are clearly on one side of that line versus other things. So the way I mentally divide this problem up is I tend to look at that, you know, estimating what I think that line is, right? So could a cyber event cross that threshold? I can imagine some scenarios, but so far it's not in my mind, still in that maintaining that gray zone. So I tend to separate that multi-domain or cross-domain stuff into just keep it nuclear, right, for now, or at least in its box, keep conventional in its place, and I think combinations thereof, right? So that's my opinion on the cross-domain kind of topics. The bilateral kind of agreements, I think it comes down to numbers. Right? You think of published numbers that, stockpiles of hundreds on the China side, right? Maybe growing to whatever thousands versus the US and Russia, tens of thousands, at least in the past, right? So I think it's a matter of scale when it comes to trilateral or bilateral kind of agreements. I tend to think the next round, I think I can understand China's position in this case of, if you look at the scale of the problem, and the threats China faces, they perceive, at least in their region of the world. I can clearly understand their hesitancy to engage in any kind of trilateral kind of agreements, or even bilateral. I think the scale of the problem with China and versus the U.S. is very different than the Russia-U.S. kind of bilateral issues that are going on. So in my opinion, as of today, and it could change with a bit of time, the bilateral agreements, I think, are the only way forward, and trilateral is too hard of a problem.
And I'll, just because I want to wrap in some of the audience questions here. So do you have any perspective on the likelihood of this Iran nuclear deal being brought back from the graveyard? And if you don't want to take this, either Sarah or Kelsey can jump in. But yeah, so I mean, the question by Jim is, when will Iran have a nuclear weapon? Which sort of seems that he doesn't have a lot of faith in the process, but I haven't actually read or heard anyone who has much faith in that process.
Yeah, I think that's the $1 trillion or question, right? Because I think it does come down to sort of cost versus benefits for that nation, right? What are the threats what are they trying to achieve in their grand strategy? And it comes down to a cost benefit decision, right? Based upon what that country views as in their greatest interest. So time, yeah, I have no opinion, but I think it comes down to those kind of things. But I'll let others answer.
I think in some ways that's an unanswerable question, right? I mean, we don't know what's going to happen with the negotiations and whether or not they can get back to a deal. And so I think it's there's literally over the past few weeks, the press reports of people going back to capitals and, are we close to an agreement now? Are they potentially getting over some of the key sticking points? That's literally kind of playing out in Vienna on a daily basis at this point. And so I think we're just kind of at that point where we don't know if all parties can come back to the agreement, and under what terms that, what would that actually look like? So I think that's a non-answer, but I don't think there is an answer really at this point.
Yeah. Sarah, would you like to add to that, or?
Just briefly, I think something Kelsey said in a previous comment about resources and the economics of these programs, I think that's going to be increasingly a factor, not so much in terms of treaty language or treaty enforcement, but yeah, as our arsenals age, to Evneet's points earlier, like they become more and more expensive to maintain, expensive to build in the first place, and so I don't know. I'm also not very optimistic about getting back into a kind of multilateral treaty making kind of place in our global politics in the immediate future. But I think compared to certainly the Cold War era, I think economics and resources are going to come into play, perhaps even more than they did even in the 1980s, right? When the Soviet Union was encountering so much a contracting economy. But yeah, that's all I'll add to the.
So there's a potential that the economic issues facing the world, or economic problems, may add some greater sanity to the nuclear arms race than we saw in the past. It's a silver lining, I guess. So a couple of the audience members raised a question that I find very intriguing, and that is, if a nuclear power plant is targeted, in particular, I'm adding to the questions here, in particular, if there is any radiological effect on the surrounding community, is that a nuclear event? Did they just, in essence, initiate a nuclear attack, right? It's been talked about, obviously, in the context of Russia and Ukraine. But before that, there were these concerns, kind of murmurs in the background in the cyber context, that what if an adversary gets in to a nuclear power plant and causes a meltdown, and that subsequently leads to a radiological effect in the community? How do we respond to that? Where is that on our escalation ladder? So what do you guys think about that? This notion of targeting nuclear power plants as part of nuclear conflict?
So I'll take that one. Kick us off maybe again. So I think it's number one, to separate things out a little bit. It's not a nuclear attack, it's a radiological attack, right? So they have now hit a reactor, and now it's a dispersal thing, just as if, we've talked in the past, it's akin to a dirty bomb in a lot of ways, but at a larger scale. Scale is really important here. So in terms of, a threshold of a armed conflict, right? It's a bad situation all the way around in terms of, we saw what Chernobyl as an example did. And I think it's the same region of as well, right? So I think we have some lessons learned from how that was handled, and from a radiological perspective, the pluses, the minuses, on how that, we have an engineering type approach to dealing with a radiological hazard. We see it, most recently in Fukushima as well. But it is a radiological, I want to be clear about that. It is not a nuclear attack. It is a radiological attack. How we handle, this mistake is, I think, it's a negative turn, as we can all probably agree. How we deal with it, I'm not clear on myself.
Yeah, I think so it really, first of all, I would say it's important to kind of step back and realize that we have not been in a situation where a nuclear power plant is in the middle of an active conflict zone. We have not we've not encountered this type of situation before, and it really, the level of of risk and frankly just really dumb things that are happening around you know, where there could be a radiological release, it really just does kind of defy logic. But I think, you know, it does kind of raise some broader questions about you know, what would the context around that type of an incident be? And you know, I think we can be sure that the Russians would not claim credit. They would, you know, it wouldn't. I think, you know, there would the disinformation around it and some of those dynamics. I think would make it an even more challenging situation. So you know, it is. Again, I think there's not a lot of great answers here. The International Atomic Energy Agency has been trying to get a team in to get back and try and there have been proposals for a zone around it. But I think, again, the kind of the near-term prospects, it really is a dangerous situation and just one that in a conflict like this, we have not seen before.
I think an interesting corollary question to this is not so much, okay, if in an active war zone, a nuclear power plant were targeted, whether that would escalate to a retaliatory strike, you know, with nuclear capacities, but rather how that sort of, if deliberate, that sort of maneuver or attack would be perceived as in the context of harming civilians, right? And in the context of war crimes and in the context of kind of the sorts of international agreements that we have on the books that govern non-nuclear types of warfare, right? More conventional kind of perspectives on that. So I don't have a good answer here for where we're headed or kind of what, as we inch closer to that being a possibility in an active conflict zone. I think it's also important to think about it not just in sort of the tactical back and forth in an armed conflict, but also the consequences on the global stage for civilians who are in the region, right? And what sorts of diplomatic and potentially military response there would be to something of a large scale civilian catastrophe.
Well, let me ask you about that. You know, Avneet made the point a couple of times, a radiological incident versus a nuclear incident. You know, that's a distinction we are familiar with, but I'm not sure how much the public is familiar with that distinction. So, you know, with the focus of your research being on how the public perceives nuclear issues, if they heard that Russia somewhat purposely hit a nuclear power plant and there was a meltdown and there is a dispersal of radiation and it is harming civilians, what do you think the American public or the Western public would do in terms of putting political pressure on its leaders, right? Because the leaders, they have the NNSA and those equivalents in other countries saying, well, sir, this wasn't a nuclear incident, but the public is the public. And do you think that how do you think they'll respond?
Yeah, I think that nuclear energy and in sort of the power perspective, and I've lost track of the Q&A now, but an earlier question was raised about nuclear energy. I think especially in the Western context, let me backtrack, especially in the US context, I think nuclear has a public relations problem in that anything radiologically hazardous kind of falls into a similar category of public anxiety. And that, you know, that's a fairly unnuanced way of saying that I think the nuclear power industry in the United States has always had to deal with the baggage of being associated with the weapons complex, right? And something that is inherently not a peaceful use. This is something that I have mapped across the last 75 or 80 years, it's fascinating to see how little division there is in public attitudes between, or how little willingness there is among the public to differentiate between radiological or nuclear, or atoms for peace and atoms for war, or nuclear power versus nuclear weapons. I think that this sort of gets all muddied in public conversations. So, Zach, to your hypothetical about how the American public would react, I think I think it would be very challenging for a lot of American lay people to see something like that as anything other than something on par with nuclear escalation.
Thank you. With that, I'm going to hand this over to our sponsors for some closing remarks. Thank you, guys.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for just a fascinating conversation. My name is Evan Verplu, and I'm the program manager at the International Relations Council here in Kansas City. I'd first like to take the time to thank our moderator, Zach, for expertly guiding us through this capacious topic, to say the least, and to our panelists, Avneet, Sarah, and Kelsey, for your thoughtful answers and considerations to the question posed in tonight's discussion. I would also absolutely very much like to thank the Linda Hall Library for facilitating and partnering with us, the IRC, on tonight's program. If you'd like to learn more about or visit the Linda Hall Library, we invite you to head to lindahall.org. Linda Hall Library is a slew of thought-provoking programs that I'm sure you'd find absolutely captivating. And to learn more about the work and upcoming events of the International Relations Council, we invite you to head to irckc.org. We have a full calendar of events ranging from discussion groups to lecture programs, and we will hope to see you there. And finally, I would absolutely like to thank the audience for taking the time out of your evening to consider the history, the present, and the future of nuclear weapons and their impact on the globe that we live in. And we hope you enjoyed tonight's program, and we hope it sparked further thoughts and considerations that you will take forward. So please enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll hope to see you on another program soon.